Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I'm Jeff Poole.
And I'm Joe Lallo.
And we've got a returning guest for you this week, Scott King. He's going to be talking about he's got a book out on outlining and kind of hopefully how to make us all more efficient. You may remember him from about a year and a half ago. He had written a book on a 5-day novel, writing a novel in 5 days, and we talked about that. So we're going to be talking today about, he's got some epic fantasy out, and he uses outlining book to help him write the novel. We'll get it there. Doing an excellent job on your introduction, Scott. Why don't you go ahead and tell us what you've been up to since I'm mangling it, and tell us about what you've been publishing too.
Yeah, sure. So what up, guys? It's great to be back. I think last time we talked, I was in Texas. I now live in Pittsburgh, which is nuts, and that's pretty much the story of my life.
All right, you're gonna be a chatty guest, I see. I can't believe you left Texas. I felt like that's like one of those places where you don't leave. It's like a religion. You're just there until they succeed from the nation. Or...
Maybe if you're born there, but...
It was interesting because when we moved to Texas, everyone was like, you meet someone new, they say, hey, what church do you go to? Now that we live outside of Pittsburgh, the first thing they say is, oh, what team do you root for? It's the Steelers, right? So it's a different culture. It's very interesting and kind of exciting. It was hard going from like, oh, this is my normal daily schedule to, oh, this is a totally new place and I need to develop a new schedule for this place.
All right. Well, what made you decide to do a book on outlining? You've done a couple of how-to kind of books for authors. Why that particular subject?
The plan was always to do a book on outline. The first book I ever self-published was Finish the Script, which was kind of like a condensed version of my college screenwriting course. And I kind of wanted to do Finish the Script, but for writing a novel. But it just takes a long time because I wrote the original draft for Outline Your Novel 2 years ago. But then because I like to tie my nonfiction books with a fiction book, I then had to write the book that I outlined. So, it was a 2-year process from I wrote the first draft, I did the rewrites, and then I sent it to beta readers, and then to the editor, then, even more readers, and then I had to get covers and all that kind of stuff. So it was just a long process going from the original concept of wanting to write it to it actually being able to come out.
All right, and we're going to ask you some questions about what you've been up to with your fiction too, because you're now an epic fantasy person. I think you were doing thrillers, and then you'd done some middle grade stuff before. What's with all the genre jumping?
I am one of those weird people who kind of says I want to write whatever it is I want to write, and it's very hard to sell your stuff that way. But once you understand how to use Facebook ads, Amazon ads, and so forth, you can make money. It's harder and you have to work for it, but it is possible. So me jumping around in genres is just kind of like, well, you know what? This is the thing I want to write and what's important to me, and so I'm going to write it now. And I've always been a long time fantasy reader. Like even my middle grade stuff is more epic fantasy than urban fantasy. So it's always something I wanted to do. I just kind of had to build up to it and make sure I was ready for it because the series is just a big series and it was a lot to take on, and I wanted to feel confident going into it.
Yeah, did I see you mention you were going to do like 9 books or 12 books, was it?
The plan is 9 books in the main series, and then between each of the main novels, I'm releasing a collection of short stories that are tied to the world. So it'll be 9 main books and then 9 short story books.
Yeah, I feel like epic fantasy is one of those genres where outlining can definitely be helpful, yeah, especially if you're want to know what happens in book 6 before you actually start writing the story. What are you talking about in your outlining book that's maybe different from just like me? I just kind of chronologically put stuff down, but I know we've had people on that do different things and probably are more efficient because of it.
Probably the biggest thing about the Outline Your Novel book that I wrote is that like all my other nonfictions, I tie them together. So in the Outline Your Novel book, you see the process I used to write my epic fantasy Wrath of Dragons. And the book is set up kind of in 3 sections. The first section is kind of laying a foundation for an education of this is what story structure is, this is how character arcs work, and all that kind of stuff. Then when I get to part 2 of the book, it's like, okay, now that you've learned the basic rules, this is how you break those rules to tell the story that you want to tell. And that's where you can kind of follow along to see where I outline. And then the final section of the book is all about how do you now adapt that outline? Because it's not just enough to make the outline. It's also like, okay, now that you have it, you need to be willing to like, you know what? Now that I know the characters, now that I see where the story is going, maybe my outline isn't as correct as I once thought it was. And now I need to kind of listen to the characters a little bit more. So it's structured so it's the foundation, the actual process of outlining, and then how to actually adapt and use the outline.
Now, that's sort of where my question was going to come from is
Mm-hmm.
I do a fair amount of outlining. I'm not super strict, but I always get to a point where the story is going in a direction that the outline did not dictate. Is that a sign that you've outlined poorly?
No, it's just an issue of you didn't know the characters as well until you actually started writing them. You didn't know their voice until you started putting that voice to page. And I mean, you guys are all authors who've written dozens of books. You guys know what it's like. You know how you get into a story and you thought this character was going to be some way, but just their personality and the way they are wasn't exactly as you had planned. And instead of forcing them to be something that they aren't, it generally helps your story to kind of embrace that and just rearrange your overall plot and plan.
When you when we talk about rearranging the plot,
Mm-hmm.
like when you realize that you've strayed from the path that you set for yourself, do you sort of stop and try to predict where the story is going to go now, or do you sort of just pants from that point forward?
The way I personally do it is generally, if I see things are getting off track, they normally aren't plot related for me, at least. They're normally all character related. And because it's just, character motivation, what the character wants, the conflict's coming maybe isn't the exact conflict that I had intended. And in that case, it's pretty easy still to follow the kind of outlines that I create. What I teach in the book is that you really need to know your own voice also as an author. It might be that you actually write better as pantsing, and maybe you don't need as deep of an outline as you think you might. So as long as you know those main beats you're trying to hit for your story, that might be all you need to do it.
So my question is I outline a bit, and just like Joe, I almost always deviate and I have to rewrite the outline. But when you create an outline, especially when you created the one for your fantasy, how detailed do you make it? Because my own outlines are pretty much just like, okay, there's a chapter title, there's a quick couple of facts that I want to make sure I cover in each chapter, and that's about it. So I don't really spend too much time on it. So the next part of that question is, how much time do you typically devote to creating an outline?
There's probably two answers to that. There's what I teach in the book, and there's then what I actually do in practice. And how I taught it in the book is I kind of took the approach of everyone outlines differently. There isn't actually no right way to outline. So where I kind of stagger it is, okay, we're going to start with coming up with your general premise of your story and kind of writing a pitch for it. And then what do you do from there? Is like, once you know your pitch, you need to decide who your POV character is. Then you need to know the basic structure. You kind of keep going until you have like a sequence outline with all the beats in it. And then you kind of flesh that out. And then you have a full list of all the scenes you have. And then if you really want to go just like to the wall outlining, you do a list of every scene. What is the conflict in every scene? Was it internal? Is it external? Is it both? What is the character's POV? What does the character want in those scenes? And all that kind of information. And the reason I go into that depth in the book is the idea of, well, someone's going to read this. They're going to see all the methods of how do you go from very, very vague to very, very detailed. And somewhere along that spectrum is going to be their happy place. And by being taught and exposed to the whole thing, they can kind of figure out where is best for them to do it when they do their own outlines. Now, for me personally, when I outline, I really am happy with just the scene list. If I can get to the point where I have a list of all my scenes and just have a vague idea of what's supposed to happen there, that's kind of my happy place.
So how long did it take you to outline your fantasy book?
It was probably a good 3 months, but that's only because I was writing the outline book at the same time. I'm now currently writing book 2 of the series, and I took like a week to do a full outline.
I suppose we should ask you, did you start out as an outliner, or were you kind of a pantser that was later converted to outlining?
My background is screenwriting. It's what I went to school for. It's what I went and taught in college. And when I was doing screenplays are very, very structure first. And so outlines are very, very important when you're writing a screenplay. So for me, my background just is always like, well, you need to at least know the beats, and outlines are kind of important. Now that I'm shifted from the different medium of writing movies to writing novels, structure is obviously important, but in a lot of cases, it's the characters and the genre that matter more than structure. So I've embraced pantsing a little bit more. It's why I can get by saying, okay, as long as I have a list of my scenes, I can normally make do.
Yeah, I'm someone who actually started as a pantser, and I used to not finish a lot of things. And even though I got to the point where I could finish novels, it was sort of after I started, let me outline this first, that I got more efficient, and I think that's helped me get to the point where I have, 50 novels or whatever I'm up to now. Do you find that, I don't know how much you get to talk to beginning writers, or, I know the book just came out. Do you find that a lot of authors are become more efficient by doing the outline first?
I think novice writers who don't know their own voice, they don't know what kind of stories maybe fit their voice best, those kind of writers normally, I think, benefit more from outlines because it's being exposed to tools that you aren't familiar with. And then once you know these tools, you can then apply them to your own kind of writing.
I found that once I started outlining, I was less likely to kind of work my characters into situations where I didn't know how to get them out of the situation. So I guess it's good to, you want to get all these high points up to your climax and stuff to kind of see ahead of time, like, do I have all the things I need to have so this won't be boring, and so maybe I won't get stuck. And I now it's a lot less likely for me to have to delete a scene completely because it didn't fit in. So for me, I've definitely found it's made me more efficient, even though I allow myself to, if I get an idea, run off and chase the shiny new thing and maybe incorporate that. Do you find that there's any mistakes that authors are making when they're sitting down to outline? It sounds like you're not real hardcore detailed in your own outlines, but is there anything that might lead people astray?
I think the biggest mistake a lot of new writers make when it comes to outline is thinking that they have to outline a certain way, and then that once they have that outline, they have to stick to it no matter what. Whereas an author who has multiple books on themselves, they at that point know, I don't need to do a full outline. I might only need to know this much. And once I get into it, I can kind of trust myself to figure out where the story is going to go for the smaller bits, as long as I know the bigger bits. So for new writers, I think it's just an experience and kind of getting more words under your belt.
Right. I think that pantsers sometimes think that if they outline, they're going to lose their creativity or something, but I still find you can be really flexible even if you did lay it down ahead of time. One more question on this from me, since you are doing a big epic fantasy series, what do you recommend for outlining? Do you do the whole series before you start? Do you do the first book and then maybe just kind of sketch out some details of the later books?
I can tell you what I do for my series. For my series, I obviously had book one fully outlined. And then I kind of had a vague idea of what I wanted for the later books. I then went and wrote book one, so I really got into the characters, the world, and all that kind of stuff. Once I finished book one, and I kind of had a more feel for what I wanted the world to be and what I want the overall story to be, that's when I outlined books 2 through 9. And for those books, I kind of did the main story beats for each one and the character arcs for the POV characters in all of them. And then at that point, once I had the big picture fully fleshed out, I went back and retweaked book one to make sure it fit and set everything up in a way that I wanted without kind of, set up mystery, but it wasn't too much mystery that it was frustrating and, so the reader was satisfied. And that's really where my beta readers came in hand was figuring out one more was I planting too much stuff for later versus one was it just, let's just cut that out and we'll deal with it later.
All right. Now, a lot of outlining and in general has to do with like getting your thoughts together so that in a condensed fashion if you're on track and all that. And condensing things down, it tends to be a trick that a lot of authors have a hard time with, particularly like when their time comes to write a blurb. So, do you think like training yourself to organize your stuff into an outline might help later on when the time comes to take your giant story and squash it down into a synopsis?
The method I teach in the book is actually to start with your blurb, right? Your blurb first as a pitch, and then plan out the rest of your novel. So at that point, It's really just a matter of, okay, you finished your book. How do you write the blurb? Oh, I just go back to the original pitch and just adapt it or change it so it matches what I actually wrote.
And how would you, like, you talk about start with a pitch. You've written about doing pitches? Like, do you have a...
After I did the 5-day novel, I did another book called Story Pitch. And Story Pitch is basically just about taking the basic concept of your story, you know, who's the main POV character, what do they want, what is the main stopping force getting in the way, what themes do you want in the story, what is your voice and the genre and those kind of elements, kind of mixing them all together and then making a pitch out of it. And the whole point of Story Pitch is just to create a tool for you to use as a writer to help plan your story. But, you know, after the fact, it's also very easily adaptable into a blurb.
It's interesting. And it's funny how, depending on what kind of a writer you are, the process can be entirely backwards. If you're a pantser, you can start with nothing, work your way up to a story, and then figure out what the blurb is. Or you could start with a blurb and work your way up to an outline and then to a full story. I don't know how many jobs can be completely inverted like that.
Just writers are special in a way that no writer writes the same way. We all have our own voice, and we all have the way we like to do things. And it's, I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of nonfiction books about writing is that they're like, these are the rules you have to follow, and if you don't follow them, you fail. And that's not how it works. I mean, I've worked with students in the classroom. I know dozens of authors at this point, and we just all kind of have to figure out what works for us.
Okay, so you already covered my last question on outlining, so I've got another one for you. Are you human like the rest of us? Do you deviate from your own outlines?
I do, and when I deviate, I talk about this in Outline Your Novel. The biggest deviation I had was, trying to think if I want to spoil stuff or not. The biggest deviation I had was with two characters, and it was two characters who were going to have a big fight scene, and then they were going to kind of be separated for the second half of the story. It didn't feel right because the motivation leading into the fight didn't really work. It was there because I kind of needed it to happen for plot reasons, but once I had written it and it was time to rewrite it, I was like, oh, this just doesn't work. I really need to go ahead and go offshoot. And the offshoot involved like a marriage and magic stuff and all this weird stuff that I hadn't planned for. But now a lot of my beta readers were like, oh my God, that is the best fight scene in the book. And it wasn't something I had planned. It was just something that evolved because the characters demanded it to happen.
So did you have to redo some of the outline or add to some of the outline to get it to steer it back on track?
Normally no, because with that kind of stuff, it's just, okay, how do I don't know, I feel like a lot of those problems, when you get to a scene where the characters aren't doing what you wanted, it's because you're forcing them to be something they aren't. And a lot of times, the way I fix, at least in my own writing, is you just need to go back and add more setup or make things clear 2 or 3 scenes ahead of time to re-establish what's going to happen later.
That's a good bit of advice, I think, for all of us to keep in mind, is that you have to be careful not to have things happening because the plot demands that it happens. You need to look at what are the motivations of these characters and why would it make sense? Like what are they trying to accomplish that they're going to do this thing? And I find it super easy to, like you were talking about, get away from that because you have these things that have to happen for the plot, you know. So it's a good tip to go back a few scenes and like set up some kind of motivation to make it plausible that they're doing those things. All right, well, we usually talk about kind of marketing and stuff like that in the second half of the show. This is a bit different since we've been talking about outlining instead of your genre and the novels you're selling. But do you want to talk a little bit about, like, if somebody that wants to get into epic fantasy now in 2018, because that's basically you kind of starting from scratch. Basically, you had different genres you've done before, but probably not a huge dragon-loving mailing list built up. So what have your experiences been so far? You just published the book 1 a couple of weeks ago. How is it pretty tough, are you finding, or how's it going?
I don't know. It's so weird jumping genres and then being able to run the ads for it and all that kind of stuff. I don't have an idea of where I should be right now or what the normal place is right now. You know, I don't know how well the book normally should be selling at this point in this genre. So it's weird coming in completely blind without that kind of stuff. I did make a launch plan. I do have a small mailing list, and I did news swaps with all that kind of stuff. So I did try to build up the launch as much as possible. But I also knew going in that most fantasy readers don't want to read book one of a 9-book series and only book one's out, because how many other series out there are never finished? It's just frustrating to readers. So most readers aren't even going to jump on until book 3 or 4. So I knew ahead of time that was the kind of problem I was going to face. And I kind of decided, well, I've been sitting on this book for a while. I could theoretically just keep sitting on it until even more books were out and do a fast release. But with my epic fantasy, I can't write it as fast as I might write a political thriller. You know, I need more time because of the world building, because you're talking, instead of a 50,000 word thriller, you're doing a 150,000 word epic fantasy with, 6 POV characters. That just takes time to write and to craft, at least the way I write. And so I kind of determined, well, if I'm going to write about 2 full novels a year, then you know what? This may not pay off for the first year and a half or 2 years. But with BookBub ads, not the featured, because I can't get those yet, but with the pay-to-click, with running Facebook ads for the AMS ads, I can at least still make money back on it and make money for these 2 years and at least get the books to break even, so that when the later books come out, it's kind of just, building, and then boom, oh, more people are reading it now magically because book 4 came out.
Yeah, it's tough to know how much to put into advertising and that sort of thing when you only have the one book and potentially $2 or $3 that you're going to earn per sale. How many clicks can you pay for without going in the hole? And I find with epic fantasy that it's probably not going to peak as high as some of the contemporary Earth-based stuff. Is just always an easier sell. You get those people that are like, they like a little magic, a little vampires, but maybe they're not diehard, wizards and made-up worlds. And so, but yeah, I think there's definitely a good audience, and I've got stuff in there right now that's doing pretty well. So it's possible, certainly. It is a challenge, though. I think you're right in that people have been burned a lot of times. We won't mention any author names on this show of a series that maybe have not had installments for a while. So are you planning to send 2 novels a year? Are you kind of wait till you may have maybe like 3 out and then try to get some BookBubs, or did you launch at full price or 99 cents?
I launched at 99 cents and I kept it there for about 10 days. And that's when I did like all my news swaps. I pushed it to my own list and all that kind of stuff. And then I upped it. And for the first, I guess it was like the week and a half, I was really high in one of my categories. And I got up to like number 6, but like above me was Anthony Ryan, Neil Gaiman, Terry Pratchett. And I was like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? I'm not going to sell more than these guys are going to do anyway. So it might even be that I just happened to pick bad categories, or I need to go and diversify that kind of stuff. But overall, I think it was a fairly good launch, and I'm still selling like 4 or 5 copies a day, even now at full price.
Yeah, there's actually a whole bunch of new fantasy categories out there right now, but I never know how many people are actually surfing in them. I'm like, oh yay, I'm number 1 in dragons and mythological creatures, but the 3 people that are actually looking for books in that category may not be jumping on board. But yeah, it's a category where there's a lot of traditional publishing presence still, unlike some of the other ones where we've talked about where like maybe there aren't that many offerings. Military sci-fi has been kind of one we've mentioned on the show a few times, where there's traditional stuff, but not that much, and it seems like there's a hungry audience. But with epic fantasy, you've not only got traditional offerings, but they're such fat books that people are probably not reading 1 or 2 a day like they may be in some of the romance categories.
Now, since we're talking about the different genres, you worked your way you worked your way forward, I should say. Up implies a value judgment, but from children's fiction working through to adult fiction and fantasy now. We've had a couple people on the show who've mentioned that despite aiming for younger audiences, most of the time the bulk of their audience comes from adults. And is there value in balancing a story to be appealing to both adults and kids?
I think it kind of depends on one, what kind of story do you want to tell? And it depends on how important is it to make it more sellable after it's written. I love my middle grade. I love reading middle grade. I love writing middle grade, but middle grade is really hard to sell. Scholastic really owns the market, and kids don't have credit cards. So it's just hard to sell it. And what I do sell, it's mostly from having done a school visit, or it's the print books, which really don't help me at all with rank. So it just kind of depends on how much do you love the genre that you want to write, and then is that love more important than whatever financial benefits there are? I happen to love epic fantasy, and I don't know if it's going to pay out or not, but chances are the books are going to break even no matter what, and I'll keep making money on them for the rest of my life. That's just kind of how this all works.
Yeah, it seems to me like the general feeling is you don't have a whole lot to gain by expanding your book to appeal to kids, but you do have something to gain from having a kid's book that is expanded forward to appeal to adults.
Yeah, but then how do you market that? How do you market the kids book that also works for adults? Because again, Scholastic owns that market. You're not going to get into a Scholastic book fair or one of their mailers, and it's just a tough sell in general. At that point, you're probably better off just writing YA because that at least does sell.
That's very true, and it's remarkable how, like, I almost feel like we got to try to find somebody from Scholastic to come on this show, because I've been to Book Expo and they have a presence there, but it's amazing the little niches in the genre that you just cannot access because there's almost a little micro monopoly on them.
Right.
Okay, so we talked to a lot of people, and I've personally heard from a lot of people who state their books are loved by both adult readers and YA readers. So when specifying the genre and keywords to your story, do you deliberately target both sets of readers? For example, if your first category you classify epic fantasy, but the second category, young adult fantasy. Do you do stuff like that?
The epic fantasy series I just launched is probably new adult or just regular adult. And for my middle grade, I wouldn't target adults for that. I would just target like all the middle grade categories.
I mean, have you ever tried experimenting with your categories or your keywords for that matter too, just to see if you can try and hit as many different other readers on both of those sets as possible?
Not generally. Normally, I just try to have them target whoever the actual audience is in that case. And with Facebook ads, Facebook is really good for targeting a lot of adult women who read middle grade. But that's the only weird subset I've been able to find outside of just the regular places.
You mentioned that with your new release, you tried a few different things for marketing. Have you been able to tell like what was most effective or maybe what was more of a waste of time?
For me, what has been most effective probably by far has been the newsletter swaps. Having other indie authors who write epic fantasy say, hey, my friend Scott King just dropped this book. It's only 99 cents for the next 3 days. You should totally go grab it. And it was kind of minimal sales at first, but my page reads then went crazy about a week or so after all those newsletters dropped. And by that point, the price had gone up. So I definitely think it was the newsletters that really gave me the biggest burst. And people are just slowly trickling in now, finally reading the novel.
It's kind of interesting because so many people right now are saying like, oh, newsletters are dead and not as effective now. I feel like they're very effective if you're the recipient of somebody giving you a boost. But the challenge is then not boring your readers or annoying them by pimping a lot of other authors. So it's kind of a little tough that way. Are you like doing the same thing and giving them mentions in your own newsletter?
It depends. In one of the cases I am, but I required that they send me the book first, and I wanted to read it first because I'm weird like that. In the other cases, it was like, oh, I have this other thriller series. Can you push this? Or, oh, I have a middle grade series. Can you maybe push this for me? Or, hey, can I just come on your podcast? So there were trade-offs, but that's just kind of how it works.
That's right. And we'll all be expecting you to pimp our books next week after being on our podcast. So don't forget that. What are your thoughts on dragons? Because that's sort of your first book's got dragons. And I've joked on here before, oh, dragons sell books. I don't really know if that's true. I've seen books with dragons on the covers do well. But at the same time, I don't know. What are you thinking? There's been a lot of dragons out there lately. So I don't know if they stand out right now.
I have no idea if that benefits it or not. I personally love dragons. One of the main characters in the story is a dragon. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan. I'm all in on dragons. I have no idea if it helps like spaceships sell military sci-fi. I don't know.
We'll have to take a poll at some point, and maybe, as Michael Cooper said, spaceship ass cells. Maybe we've all been showing the dragons from the wrong end, and that'll be the next thing. I don't know. So, what are you
Come
gonna
on.
do?
Wouldn't that be an interesting conversation with the illustrator? Listen, for my next cover, I need the rear end of a dragon on there and make it sexy.
I'm actually not sure I've ever seen the rear end of a dragon on a fantasy novel, so I don't know. Maybe illustrators will boycott that. So, have you done any freebies or anything designed to help you grow your mailing list that tie into the epic fantasy stuff?
At the end of the book, I have a plug for, hey, get the short story. When I release the first collection of short stories, there's another, say, hey, sign up for the mailing list, and you get this other short story. Building up to now, I've done a bunch of giveaways and that kind of stuff. I've given away my other books that are at least fantasy adjacent to build my list. So, I mean, I launched with a 5,000 list, which, again, isn't a big list, but it wasn't completely nothing.
All right, now we're talking a lot about, the sort of subject here is epic fantasy, and oddly enough, it doesn't seem to be the case with a lot of other genres, but epic fantasy is frequently defined by just a very long story. I mean, epic, Do you feel like an epic fantasy needs to be like a 150,000 word novel or, a 10-part series, or is that a crucial part of the formula, or is it really more of a plot content thing and just the plot and content tends to expand that far?
I think it's more of a plot content. Epic fantasy is pretty much second world fantasy, so it's never epic fantasy that happens on Earth. In addition, it's normally some big world-changing event. That's, armies are clashing, the world's going to be destroyed if things don't happen. And to tell those kind of stories, you just need more space.
So let's say, for example, let's say you do a 5-book series in Epic, and it does very well, but you sort of concluded that tale, and you had no expectation of going further. Does an epic fantasy then sort of downgrade to standard fantasy once the stakes aren't global anymore?
I think it just kind of depends. In terms of the globalness of it, I don't know, because at that point, it depends. What are your subgenres? Are you verging on high fantasy? Is it more adventure? Is it just kind of a dungeon crawler? It just kind of depends on what other aspects, I guess, are in your story, and do those subgenres are overwhelming that they kind of are the big umbrella instead of epic fantasy being the big umbrella.
Now, you mentioned that you've already talked about how your book is at least 150,000 words long. You've also still work with writing children's fiction. So obviously there's a big difference between size there. My question to you is, how dedicated is your day to actually writing? Do you actually set yourself a schedule? Do you have like a word count you strive to hit every single day? How do you set your day up?
I am a big proponent of not doing word counts because they drive me crazy, and it's math. And then, like, if you don't hit it, you just feel like poop. So what I do is every morning, my wife is a chemical engineer. She goes to the chemical plant and does like chemical stuff. And I go to the coffee shop and I do writing stuff. And I'm generally at the coffee shop from about 6:45 till 10 or 11. And that's my writing time. And then I come home. I normally walk the dogs, exercise, do cooking and cleaning. And then my afternoon is, whatever business or publishing stuff that has to happen.
Oh, that's not so bad. So let me see what else I got here. So with regards to, you actually spend that many hours that on the same coffee shop every single day?
Yeah, when we moved to Pittsburgh, we went to all the coffee shops in all the towns, and I picked the one that I liked. And we moved to the town that has a nice coffee shop so that I could go there, and that would be my office.
And that was actually a motivating factor when you chose which area and neighborhood you wanted to live in? That's awesome. I'm going to have to remember that one.
Well, we moved to Pittsburgh officially for her work, and I was like, well, if we're going to move for your work, we got to kind of make sure it's beneficial to my work too, and that's how we picked our house.
Now, how does your wife feel about that? Like, you get to spend so much time. Does she realize you're working, or just kind of sit back and just type it away on a laptop?
Oh, she knows it's work. She's tried to be at home when I'm working, and I get so frustrated because she's so distracting. So she definitely is full embrace of like, yes, go to the coffee shop, do your thing, and then come home and do whatever else you got to do.
Having been married for 18 years, I'm definitely going to go no comprendo on that one. So.
All right. Well, last little thing for me is just how are you finding Kindle Unlimited for epic fantasy? It seems like with all the reward for having a lot of pages read, hopefully, that there's a lot of potential. But at the same time, I feel like maybe epic fantasy people, like I said earlier, are not the ones that are voraciously reading necessarily, or maybe they are, but it still takes a good chunk of time to get through a 150,000 words isn't too bad, but there are some 300,000 word novels out there too. So I guess how are you finding Kindle Unlimited?
It's weird because again, I don't have that base. I don't know what is normal for epic fantasy. I can say that my page reads through KU prior to the book's release, so my nonfiction, my thriller, my dystopian, my middle grade stuff, all those my page reads were normally about 25,000 per month. I checked earlier today, and for the first month release so far of Wrath of Dragons, I just broke 100,000 page reads. So it's definitely way, way, way more than all my other stuff combined. And I don't know if I am where I should be, whether that's normal or what, just because, again, I'm new to the genre.
Now, we're talking about the size of the epic fantasy series that you've planned, and also about the tendency for people to not trust an epic fantasy series that only has one book out because of the tendency for people not to finish. That can cause problems, I think. Well, let's imagine that you've got, let's say, I don't know, a 12-book series that you're planning, and you get 4 or 5 or 6 books in, and you realize that it's not going as well as you would hoped. Do you sort of How far ahead do you plan the potential exit from the series? Like, do you install ripcords? Because obviously, if you're thinking of quitting the series, you don't have a lot of readership, but you probably don't have zero readership, and you don't want to leave them hanging. So, like, where is the balance between making the sound business decision versus serving the audience?
For me, I don't think it's a business decision or an audience decision. It really comes down to what story do I want to tell. And I mean, I have a Lovecraft choose your own adventure book that I have in sell, and it does really well. So clearly I am an author who believes that he writes what he wants to write. And this is a story that I've wanted to write for a long time. This is something that's really important to me. I love epic fantasy, and this is kind of like my love letter to the genre. You know, there's dragons, there's wizards, there's assassins, there's shapeshifters, there's old races and gods and all this crazy stuff. You know, it's everything I love about epic fantasy. So it's nothing I'm going to quit, even if it doesn't sell well, just because this is a story that's important to me. And business-wise, I can maximize ads. I can still make the books profitable, even if they aren't huge hits.
Along those same lines, there's value in sort of, when you get an audience, making it clear, I finish what I start. So don't worry about being left hanging. I'm writing this for me. I'm glad you're along for the ride, but we're going to get to the end no matter what. And I have to say, I understand your I'm going to write what I want to write situation, because as listeners of the show know, I about once a year will put out a book that no earthly human would ever want to read. And eventually, whenever I mention it on the show, I'll get an email saying, I read it and I'm waiting for the sequel. So there's always somebody who wants the stuff.
For the record, I do the same thing. If I start a series, I will finish it. It won't leave anyone hanging, because I've run across a couple of series that, like, when's the next one coming out? And the author will be like, I don't know, not making a lot of money, not really worried about it. So, all right. Okay, so my last question for you is, what have been some of the most difficult obstacles to overcome with regards to releasing your epic fantasy novel, when compared to children's fiction, that is?
The hardest dilemma I had with the book was deciding when to actually release it, because I finished it about 2 years ago. So I've kind of been sitting on it this whole time, and I decided, well, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and get all the production stuff taken care of. So I have all the covers done for the 9 main books and the covers done for the 9 collections of short stories. And then I was like, well, I want it to be super fancy. So I went ahead and hired an artist, and they did all the chapter headers for all the POV characters and so forth. And then I was like, well, I'm still a little nervous about, maybe I'm leaving too much mystery, or maybe certain things aren't clear. It's a little too confusing to certain places. So then I did extra rounds of beta reading, and it was just me kind of stalling because I was worried the book wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, because that's just how important the story is to me. And it's not like I haven't written a book before. It's not that I haven't published before. It's that for some reason this is a little bit more special to me, and because of that, I kind of dragged my foot just to make sure it was finally ready.
How did your beta readers take to it, if you don't mind me asking, the first time around? Did they like it, or they're like,
It was so weird working with the beta readers because most of my work at most has 2 POV characters. The book has 3 main POVs and then 3 kind of sub POVs, and it's been really weird getting the feedback because the readers all gravitated towards different characters, and that was something I hadn't seen before. I hadn't seen, certain readers be like, oh my God, this character is the best, and you need more stories with just them, blah, 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 blah. And then having a totally different reader come in and be like, oh, that character, they were the worst. I hated them. But this character was amazing. Why isn't there more of this character? And so I think that's just partially just the genre itself, is because the books are so big. They have a much more wider breadth in the depth you can do with those characters and the different kind of personalities you can kind of mesh together that readers grasp to different things. And it's kind of even an insight into the reader itself. It's like, oh, they really like that character. That kind of tells me something about who they are as a reader. And so that's just was the most interesting thing of the beta readers was seeing how people gravitated towards different people.
All right, I think we're kind of done with our questions here on epic fantasy and outlining. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on that we haven't asked you yet today?
I do a podcast. My podcast is called The Creators Cast. You can check it out on iTunes and so forth. You can find me personally. I am on Twitter at Scott King. My website is www.scottking.info. My epic fantasy is Wrath of Dragons. Check it out if you want to read it. And if you're curious about outlining and how I created it, check out Outline Your Novel.
All right, I will definitely put the links in to your pages on the site. And actually, I forgot to ask you about the podcast. Do you find that helps at all with selling your books, your fiction or nonfiction, or is it more just for the love of it thing?
Oh, it is totally just for the love of it thing. Because I don't do Patreon, I don't do any of that kind of stuff. It's just a matter of, hey, I get to talk to really good people who make amazing things, and sometimes you even get to learn from those people. And there's definitely influences of things I've picked up from guests on the show that I've then applied to my own work. So it's beneficial, but not directly beneficial.
Right. Every now and then we'll have a guest where I'm over here like taking notes on the side. It's like, oh, this is actually good stuff. I should pay attention here. And it is fun. It's like you're getting a free tutoring session when you get somebody really smart on, or just that's got experience in areas you don't have experience in. But all right, I guess we will wrap it up there. And this is episode 174. If you want to come by marketingsff.com, and I will have the link to Scott's outlining book and his fantasy if you want to check that out, and also to the podcast. Thank you. And thanks for joining us today, Scott. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for actually being willing to come back and hang out with us again.
So long, everybody.